this is something where, somebody realizes, hey, you know what, if I really want to reach my goals, that's what's most important. The financial planning is most important, not necessarily the investments. And this is typically where we see adjustments to an investment strategy that's more sustainable, more geared towards their actual financial planning goals.
Welcome to the Live Greater View, a financial planning podcast produced by VLP Financial Advisors that discusses life, money, and perspective. We help clients live their best life at every stage through our VLP Live Greater partnership process. Thank you for tuning in. All right. Welcome back. I'm Rose Price, Certified Financial Planner and partner here.
I'm Chris Mellone, partner and certified financial planner.
So great topic today. Why should I start thinking about retirement now? Something that comes up a lot we see, and really we're going to dive into all the different stages, and it's never too early to start thinking about it.
It's a topic that we can add a lot of value because we've seen how this changes over the years. We'll start working with clients when they're younger, mid-career, and all of a sudden they're, retired and, we're working with families often. So it's something that we think we can provide a lot of perspective on.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is kind of the statistics around it, right? There was a study, according to the Journal of Financial Planning, that 60% of retirees underestimate how long they're going to live by 5 years. So that could be a big difference. We do planning lots. We try to run that out to age 99. Some clients push back on that because maybe they don't want to live that long. That's a different topic. We'll talk about that later. But certainly I think the number is the real value in having that discussion is we underestimate and making sure we're planning for that longevity.
Right. And you see healthcare continues to innovate. People are living longer, all those sorts of things. And it's one of those commonalities that it's so distant, it's so far in the future. And then all of a sudden you're in the day-to-day and you're retiring thinking, wow, like where did all this time go by? And then next thing you know, you see a statistic like that. The second one that we really, think is interesting that jumps off the page, according to Transamerica, 73% of retirees wish that they had saved more for retirement.
Yeah, we don't usually meet someone who said, man, I saved too much, right? I mean, there are clients who have saved more than enough money. They'll never spend all of it in their lifetime, but people worry about not having enough. So having more saving and having that cushion gives that peace of mind and freedom to kind of enjoy retirement a little bit more.
And I think this one is a testament to how fast time flies by.
Yep.
Because obviously it's talked about. A lot of people say, oh, I know I need to save. I know, I think about the long term, all of those things. But if everybody truly did that and truly followed through, this wouldn't be a statistic that's so prevalent.
That's true. So let's kind of shift gears. So let's talk about early career. You're just starting out. This is probably one of the key times to start creating those habits, right? Starting to save, getting accustomed to putting money away consistently. And, some of the big things that it benefits is really, more time to accumulate savings and interest.
Definitely. So compound interest, in our business, it's known as the eighth wonder of the world, something that, truly differentiates somebody who's younger, somebody that has that much more time versus somebody that is mid or even later career. And when I'm meeting with early career participants, even at our 401k plans, oftentimes we'll just in an organic conversation talk about, stocks that they've heard of or things that they've seen on TV. And I share with them, 9 times out of 10, somebody that's in their 40s, 50s, 60s that's talking about a particular stock or sector or whatever, they don't have the edge that person has because that person has all of the time in the world to save. Correct. So they really have the true edge that in most cases that no stock or sector is going to be able to offer them.
Yeah, and a conversation I typically have in that same scenario is, if you can average the old 72T, if you can average 7% over 10 years, your account doubles. And I tell clients, it's not the first double that counts, it's the last, right? If you've had time in, let's say you start out in your 20s and you have $50,000, all right, you got 100, right? 7-10 years later. But what if that 100 becomes now 200? That 200 becomes 4, and now you got $1 million that becomes 2. It's really that time in, that ability to kind of have that money work for you versus if you start later, which we'll talk a little about, you're kind of behind. You're behind the 8 ball.
Right, especially that last double or last 2 doubles. That's obviously what really moves the needle. And you alluded to at this stage just really forming the habit.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily about the dollar amounts or percentages and getting, necessarily tied down in all of the nitty-gritty details. It's, hey, you're building a foundation, you're building the habits that's going to take you well into your career and beyond.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the beauty of the 401k. That's kind of the first introduction we see a lot of the younger generation, and certainly in our 401k plans, getting an introduction to that habit, right? And 401k is great, especially with auto enroll, because as I tell, the money goes before you get access to it. And there's like effort to get it back. So we tend to see people not touch that money, and it grows. And sometimes we go into a 401k plan, they've been in auto enroll, and we're like, oh, how long have you been here? And they're like, 2 years. I'm like, oh, you're in the 401k. They're like, no, I'm not. We're like, yeah, you are. We open up and they're like, oh, like they don't realize how quickly that money, especially if they have a match, comes into play.
Right. And another interesting dynamic is somebody that's early in their career, they're trying to do all the right things. They try to emulate like what the senior people,
Yep.
at their firms do. And again, just in conversation, they'll say, hey, is this something good? And I'll say, if you look at, the CEO suite, here and all the executives, they've been doing this. They know it's the right thing to do. And again, it's, hey, I'm establishing these habits at work and doing all the right things. And then on the financial planning front, they want to do the same.
Yeah, and also if they start this at home, right? If they just start consistently putting money into savings, doing their 401k, and then eventually if they can do an individual account, what really comes into play when you're starting early is what if something happens? What if you have a life event that was out of your control? You had a medical issue, you lost a job, something to that effect. Now you have something to fall back on. This creates less stress. Having that capability, we've seen it. We go into the 401k plans and someone walks up to you and goes, man, if it wasn't for my 401k, I wouldn't have been able to get by, because they didn't want to have to tap it, but they're back, they're working, and they want to be in that plan because they know that helped them.
Right, for sure. And then it's, that can come obviously from kids, situation at work, health events, all of the above.
The list goes on.
Right,
Yeah.
right, it goes on and on. So very common scenario. And, finally, you've alluded to it, a number of different times, but the employer matching component,
huge.
That is something that, it's free money, so to say. If you're enrolling in all of your benefits, that is something that you should do right away.
Yeah, I always tell clients, I said, if you have this opportunity to go in a 401k and they're going to match, and let's say you decide, oh, I'm not going to do that, I'll sign up later, but they're giving you a 3 or 4% match. Nobody comes to you at the end of the year and go, oh, you didn't participate in the 401k. Here's a 3% or 4% bonus. And to date, in 24 years of doing 401ks, I've never had that happen. So again, it's that free money that you don't get if you go down to the bank and say, well, I'll just save on my own. I'll open my own IRA. The bank's not going to match you either. Right. 100% up to 3. I mean, that can really move the needle in your long term.
Right. It's such a no-brainer. Great. Well, obviously we've covered a lot if you're early in your career. Let's shift gears to if you're in the middle of your career.
Yep.
Different dynamic. By this point, you probably had, some ups and downs and you've got your feet under you. Let's talk about things that should be on your mind if you're at that stage.
Yeah, and this is an area where we definitely can see where life can creep in. We call it kind of the sandwich generation.
Right.
You might be in a scenario where you have kids, you have aging parents, and there's an event where you might have to take off work or do family leave because you have to care for somebody, or you need to leave the workforce for a period of time. So again, this having the ability to have some assets set aside that you may have started, it starts to give you that ability to have options, right? Because in some cases, if you have no options, if you have nothing to back you up, you're kind of stuck.
Right. And in this stage, you're kind of in that sweet spot where it's, hey, you know what? I'm not earlier in my career, but I'm also, not at the end of my career. I know what I did right. I know what I did wrong. And I have enough time to course correct if you need to.
Yeah. And that's really when you start to take stock of what is my lifestyle and how am I going to maintain it, right? This is where we start to see people start to seek out individual financial planning, right? They want to come in, they go, all right, maybe the kids are going to college, maybe, things have shifted and some expenses are starting to go away. Yep. And they're cognizant of that, and they don't want to just take this money and let lifestyle creep come into play.
Right, definitely. And, we'll have these conversations. Let's say somebody's in their mid-40s and, one thing leads to the other, and we'll talk about their investments. And inevitably, they'll tell you things that they did wrong. They'll say, hey, I got, 1 or 2 right, but I got, a lot wrong along the way. And this is something where, somebody realizes, hey, you know what? If I really want to reach my goals, that's what's most important. The financial planning is most important, not necessarily the investments. And this is typically where we see adjustments to an investment strategy that's more sustainable, more geared towards their actual financial planning goals.
Yeah, and it also gives them flexibility, right? It gives them the opportunity to kind of be in control of their situation. We also see what creeps in is, we have this group of generation where maybe their parents have supported them because things are expensive. Things have gotten more expensive. And now they don't have to, if they have these assets they've start to set aside, they've started to think through these things, you don't have to rely on others. I mean, that's a the freedom it is that you can now have a plan, you have decisions, and you have other assets that potentially can help you when you have some scenarios that pop up that are unexpected.
Sure, and that's a great inflection point where it's like, hey, you're young, you're trying to make your way. It's all about dollars and cents. If you get to this stage of your career, you're like, hey, it's that's
Right.
not what it's all about. It's all these other things. So it's definitely something that you see sort of that light bulb go on.
And it leads into the psychological benefits, right? This is really where we start to see, you have kids, you've got a house, you have all these expenses and these different pieces of the puzzle. And by, kind of really honing in and taking stock of where you are, making sure you're on track, doing that kind of litmus test, where am I going to go, just can reduce the anxiety, right? It can give you that ability to kind of say, okay, I've got a plan. Things are going to happen inevitably, but we know we can shift that plan. We can adjust on the fly versus as you don't have any plan. It's really hard to get a plan.
Yeah.
Quick.
Yeah. And by this stage, the clock is ticking,
Yeah.
For sure. And let's talk about somebody that's later in their career.
Yep.
This, sort of, segment of our conversation gets painted with such a broad brush, and some things apply, some things don't apply. Let's talk about why this really comes to the forefront from planning for retirement for later in your career.
Yeah, I mean, at every stage, any amount you can save is going to help you. So even in a late career stage, and typically, what you'll see is, in this late stage career, you get through, if you had a family, if you have kids, your expenses are starting to go down, right? Yep. Maybe the mortgage is paid down, you have less debt, you don't have student loan debt. So now there's this maybe excess of cash. And sometimes this doesn't pop up until that later stage. Right. And you're going, okay, I know I'm behind because I didn't get to save as much as I wanted to. Maybe I started later. But even just having that ability to start now really can put you on a track to be able to meet your retirement goals. Maybe you won't have to work till 70 or 75. Maybe you can figure out and save enough in between now and then to be able to retire on time.
Right. And an angle of the conversation that comes in into play with this is, if somebody all of a sudden has less expenses, or even if they started later saving, the conversation that we'll often have is, hey, you're not saving to, so you can retire at age 65 and that's it. You're saving so you can spend money in your 70s, 80s, 90s.
Correct.
So you're meeting with somebody that's, say, in their mid 50s. You're saying, well, it's not 10 years till you need this money. This needs to last you 30 plus years. And when you zoom out and put it in that context, that's when they say, oh, okay, I actually have a lot of money or a lot of time to put this money to work.
That's correct. Yeah. And, again, it comes back to, what is this then leads to the conversation of how much risk you want to take. How does that going to look? How's it going to feel? What are your other resources? And certainly, in some cases, clients we meet are better off than they think.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you bring up, where going into this later stage, we tend to see the investment options tend to become a lot more, I would say, interesting from the fact that if you're somebody that's younger, earlier mid-stage career, it's, hey, I want to invest in stocks and make as much money as I can and compound, and that's all great things. But when you get to this stage, it's, wow, what do bonds, what they actually do? How do they fit into the plan?
You should listen to our other
podcasts.
podcasts.
Listen to the other podcasts. How do I take this, pot of money and translate it into helping, myself live in retirement, supporting my family? So that's another inflection point where it goes from, it's not all about stocks and, finding these companies and things that will compound. It's, hey, take a look at the conservative investments and how those fit into.
Yeah, because there's a time and a place for all of that. And that certainly is, as you get closer to that, one of the biggest concerns we hear is, I can't live through another 2008. I don't have time to recover. Right. And the reality is, a portion of your portfolio can live through a 2008, a big pullback in the market, if you have these other conservative investments to help you kind of get through that period. And if you need to access, or in some cases, be able to, you have some assets now that you can move into that more aggressive scenario to bounce back.
For sure. And, on the back of that, we're talking about, hey, you know what, you're at the stage where you can take your foot off the throttle a little bit. Mm-hmm. That naturally leads into a conversation about legacy planning.
Yep.
As in, what does retirement look like? And we'll go through all those normal things, but then what do you want your legacy to be? How do you want your family and the things that you care about to remember you? And that's a very sort of natural, way that the conversation tends to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that comes into play too. We're also seeing clients in this stage trying to determine what retirement's going to look like. And in some cases, is it to your point, taking your foot off the throttle a little bit, and they're going to coast in. Maybe they're going to do something. They're going to go from full time to maybe a couple 4 days a week and 3, and they want to kind of still stay engaged, but it isn't necessarily a switch. There are some clients as a switch. I don't want to work a day past this age, and this is my goal, and I want to get there. But it's also a part of that time we're talking about, what does the next chapter look like? What is going to keep you engaged? What are you going to do? How are you going to stay active and involved? And how will your investments and what you've saved be able to help you to do that?
And that's something in our prior podcast that we talked a lot about, that just needs time to really sit in your gut, time to simmer, time to engage with a firm like ours to help you unpack, that sort of thing, because that's not something that you're going to be able to say, hey, I'm going to knock this out and what it's going to look like. It's obviously going to take time.
And a couple other things, you really got to focus on your late career, which will also, work into your retirement, is, your debt. Do you have debt? What is the plan to eliminate or reduce that debt? How does that look? What's the glide path if you have a mortgage? Are you going to sell and relocate? All these pieces will come in, because, again, that can just improve your retirement picture.
Right. And there's not, like a lot of things that we do, there's not a right or wrong answer to a lot of those things. So, contrary to what you may read or see, online, there's no, hey, this is the perfect way to go about it. Here's a silver bullet. Again, it changes from situation to situation.
Yeah. So one of the other things we'll touch on just too in the late stages is the catch-up contribution. Mm-hmm. So I have a birthday this year, which will make me eligible for the catch-up contribution. We won't talk about what age that is, but you are allowed to put in additional funds into your 401k plan, for example. So you could do another $7,500 this year. Then there's this interesting, under the Secure Act 2.0, between age 60 and 63, you can do a little bit more than that. You can do 150% of the catch-up, so up to $11,000 and change this year. So these are, sometimes we meet with clients and they're not aware of this. This gives them that ability to put additional funds, whether they do traditional 401k or a Roth. And that's another piece we'll talk about, what type of investments are you utilizing as you are in this late stage makes the most sense for your long term.
And a common misconception with the catch-up contributions is, I need to be that age, as in that's the line in the sand to make those contributions, or that is not true. Right. You just need to be turning that age during that calendar year.
Yeah, I know.
So I would say, I would say 9 times out of 10 when we bring that up, they say, oh, my birthday's in July. I thought I could only start doing that after my birthday, and it's not the case.
That's right. So great pieces, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, we jumped around a lot. I think that, as us going through this list of, hey, early, mid, late stage career, these are off the cuff things that are on our minds. And I think just through the repetitions that we've gotten through meetings over the years, it's the best of the best.
Yeah, and I really think that what echoes through here is, no matter what stage you are, it's always good to start thinking about, what are your habits going to be, starting those and being consistent with saving and planning. So this can just set you up for a more comfortable retirement and on a path where you can continue your lifestyle.
Awesome. Well, this is great. As we wrap up here, it's interesting, some of the topics that have gotten the most views for us recently have been questions from clients, whether we get those directly to our website, to Melissa, our marketing coordinator, or just questions that come up during meetings, organically. So we would just ask, if you're listening to this and there's something that is top of mind, something that you think, hey, it'd be good to get their take on this, we'd be happy to include that in a future episode. As always, we ask that if you found value in this, please pass this along to your family and friends. Our YouTube channel continues to grow. Our subscribers are up, over 50% over the last handful of months, and we're knocking on the door of 40,000 views. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Live Greater View. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Spotify and recommend our podcast to family and friends. To learn more about VLP Financial Advisors, please check out our website at vlpfa.com. Thanks again.
And now for our necessary disclosures. Securities and advisor services offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a broker-dealer and registered investment advisor. All investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will be successful. The views stated in this podcast are not necessarily the opinion of Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities mentioned. Due to the volatility with the markets mentioned, opinions are subject to change without notice. Information is based on sources believed to be reliable. However, their accuracy or completeness cannot be guaranteed. Past performance does not guarantee future results.